you haven't really experienced a building until you've tried to frame it in your viewfinder of your camera. And it's terribly true. The proportions suddenly become meaningful when you try to frame them. That's what you're doing with the camera. But on the other hand, you can't take informative photographs of buildings unless you understand the building, because you know which details to incorporate, which angles, not just do the facade and move on. So they work together, yes. You can't do the one without the other. When I came to Australia, I felt rather desperate about the landscape. It all seemed to be very flat and uninteresting, and coming from Europe just didn't do anything for me, until I tried doing very close-up photography of small flowers, particularly orchids and insects. So a square metre of ground was very rich in views. I like to be different. A hobby like photography it is now very popular, but 30, 40 years ago I was an oddity. And I had been very interested in architecture, but never really combined it with photography. And then they got me into the National Trust. The Trust was classifying as a precinct the whole of the West End of Fremantle, which is a very important precinct. The West End of Fremantle was the most intact Victorian, by which it meant Queen Victoria, urban environment anywhere in the world, rivaling Manchester, Melbourne, you name it. And that then went into the Trust archives to illustrate the classification, and formed the basis of, I think, probably the first major exhibition in the then recently opened Fremantle Arts Centre, which is the first time I'd ever tried showing anything in public, and I got to like it, and I've been doing it ever since. We migrated to England in 1938, in very good time before terrible things happened, from Prague to London, and I was educated and lived grew up in England. I stopped being Czech when I went to an English boarding school. That was the end of that episode. I became completely anglicised. Father was extremely lucky. He was Secretary General of the Czech Federation of Czech Chemical Industries, and one of his members said, "Look, you're of Jewish origin. The Nazis are coming. You'll lose your job. I'll lose my business here. I'm building a factory in England, chemical factory. Would you take the job of being managing director of my British company and run the place?" He wanted me to go into partnership, and the last thing I want to do, I'm very fond of my father, the last thing I want to do was to go into partnership with him. So I chose the very opposite and decided to become a lawyer. Wanted to do my own thing always. I saw an advertisement, leading European solicitors firm in Singapore, wanting an assistant solicitor, newly qualified. So I applied. I'm sure I was the only applicant. Roma arrived in Singapore, I think a few months after I did, with a Colonial Office contract. It was a colony, of course, then. A Colonial Office contract at the General Hospital. She was very lively and nice sense of humour and attractive, all those good things. Then we decided to get married, which we were in the Anglican Cathedral in Singapore.
What are Michael's strongest traits? Talking. Always interesting. Very stimulating. So we always, when he went out to dinner, it would always be interesting conversations. And that I learnt to value very much. But he wasn't the sort of person I thought I would marry at all. No, quite different. But that's always a good thing, I think.
When we first arrived here in Australia, I had an ambition, which I'd formed years ago in England, that I'd like a block of land running down to a river. Well, we do live it to the full. Roma does all the gardening and she loves it. And it's as important to her as photography is to me. As a migrant who lived here a few years, I really didn't understand the environment. So we then spent 12 months, every fine Saturday morning, or whole Saturday, tramping up and down the Swan Coastal Plain, photographing what ended up as George Siddon, The Sense of Place. He more or less wrote the book in pace with my taking the pictures. So I've always had bookish pursuits as a relief. And I retired early at the age of 63, which for a lawyer is very early, to be able to devote myself entirely to the sort of unpaid activities that I'd found in my later career to be very fulfilling. And again, I was lucky. Somebody suggested me to come into the National Trust, and in the fullness of time I served 2 terms as chairman, and I persuaded them to radically reorganise things. Tom and I worked particularly well together. His job was to run the trust as CEO, and I've always regarded the chairman's job as primarily keeping the CEO motivated, organised, and on the right lines. He was very keen on making sure that council, and particularly the chairman, I suppose, became familiar with the trust properties. And I would travel the length and breadth of our territory within Western Australia, visiting the properties, spending the night, talking to local authorities. So I became very familiar with trust properties and photographed them, of course, at the same time. And the trust now has a fairly big collection of my photographs of trust properties over many, many years. So I've had to learn to Photoshop quite extensively, and I've had to set rules for myself, which I advocate when I lecture, as to what you can tinker with and what you shouldn't. As with the borough charter, you must not tinker with the fabric. After I retired from practice, I was for some years on the lottery's Heritage Committee, which actually decided which heritage projects to beneficiate. I was rather involved at one stage in redrafting the Lotteries Act provisions to make sure that ministers couldn't grab any of it, and we succeeded in that. They've never been able to do anything like it since. Perth's heritage is gone, virtually. It had it when I first came here and demolished it all before even a national trust really got going, let alone a heritage council. Well, the first battle was lost, of course, over the colonial barracks, and that's really what caused the trust to be set up. The Treasury building, and particularly the Lands Titles Office, East Frontage, the Italian-aid frontage, that's a real gem and a great shame because it's never found a use since the government, wrongly in my mind, decided to abandon it. They told me I was the first photographer allowed to take pictures in Fremantle Jail, living memory because of the security side. And I got a pretty full coverage, which not only got in the report, but later on formed the nucleus, if you like, of my first major exhibition, which was put on by George Seddon's then wife. One always has to have a purpose for doing anything, and if you get some feedback that people enjoyed your pictures, well, that's good. The migration was a fluke. How I Met Roma was a fluke. But everybody's got these chances in their lives, I think. Mine were very productive.